Back in England, local school students used to regularly visit the synagogue. It was part of their religious education. It's something I wish would happen here in the US much more. That secular students would go and learn about other religions, not to proselytize in any way, but because it was important to learn about the diversity of humanity. And they would always go to the Orthodox community first, and then they would come to our Reform community. And it was very deliberate why they did that. Because when the students would go and see the Orthodox building, they would notice that there were 2 floors, and they would also notice that there was a mechitza, a divider. And they would ask about it and would be told that the men and women are separated in the sanctuary, and that men have certain roles and women can't do certain things. For example, they would be told men are obliged to come up and read from Torah, but women mustn't come up to Torah because they might be menstruating, and that might pass impurity onto the Torah scroll. And the teachers knew that that wasn't true, because they had heard it from me, and I'd shown them the sources. And so what would happen is they would go to the Orthodox, and then they'd come to us. And I would then say, look, men and women sit together in our community because we're welcoming and inclusive, and men and women can come up and can read from Torah and lead a service and be rabbis. And one of the students would say, wait, but we were just told in the other community that women who are menstruating will add impurity to a Torah scroll, and that's why they can't come up. And I would tell them that's actually not true. The reason is only because it embarrasses the men. The men are obliged to perform the mitzvah, and how embarrassing that a woman would come up and perform the mitzvah instead of a man who is obliged. That's the actual reason. And that, I think, is really important, because when we talk about gender in Judaism, we often are filled with things that are informed about things that aren't actually true. And gender and Judaism is actually really important, because the way that the Jewish community has expressed itself through prayer, through study, through theology, has always been gendered. And so when we look at our own Judaism, we have to ask ourselves about gender, and Reform Judaism is particularly aware of gender. And it was Reform Judaism that said, look, we are welcoming and inclusive and open, and therefore we encourage women to do exactly the same things that the men have done in the past. So women are allowed to come up to the bima. Women are allowed to be rabbis. Women are allowed to be honorary men. They're allowed to do the things that men have always done. And I shared many years ago in this community in a High Holy Day sermon the challenge of that, which is that that's not really finding the authentic voice of Jewish women. It's just allowing women to be honorary men. And our challenge is to bring out that voice of women. And since then, we've seen some extraordinary liturgy having been written by our community. And the Reform movement was very passionate, actually, about creating liturgy that adapted. So, for example, on page 84 of the Siddur, you can see that we actually have pronouns, different pronouns. In the past, the pronouns for men were only used in the service. She'asani ben chorin, God, thanking God who has made me free. But the Reform Siddur gave a choice of pronouns, ben chorin for men, bat chorin for women. It said, look, we've now covered the whole gender spectrum. And they also added women into the tefillah, into the amidah, adding the imahot, the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And I remember, going back to Bournemouth, I remember first leading this prayer with the imahot, with the matriarchs, and having fought for inclusivity for a very long time at that community, suddenly being faced with the reality on a Shabbat of actually adding the matriarchs into the liturgy. And you may think nothing of that, but for our community it was a very big moment. And for me it was a very big moment, because I realized I am now breaking 2,000 years of tradition of reciting this prayer. Now, I very quickly reminded myself, no, actually, 2,000 years of tradition of this prayer actually included adding things to this prayer. For example, there's in the weekday Amidah, there is a prayer about those who would inform on the Jewish community, and that was added as a historical for a historical reason. And at the same time, I'm a Reform Jew, and Reform Judaism means not necessarily being bound to the tradition of the past. It means acknowledging the tradition, holding the tradition, and asking, is that tradition still relevant to us today? Because the God of the Bible is not and has not always been the God of the Talmud, or the Mishnah, or the God of Kabbalah, or the God of the Enlightenment, and so on. We understand God anew. And if we can understand God anew, then we have to be able to understand ourselves anew as well, if we truly believe that we are created in God's image. Excuse me, I remember also here, quite a few years ago, we decided instead of the Aleinu, the traditional Aleinu, we decided for one service to sing the Judy Chicago song, which has the line, and then both men and women will be gentle. And somebody who hadn't been to services before in a long time came up to me after the service and said, I'm not coming back. And I said, wow, tell me why, what's happened? And they said, because you say that you're open and inclusive and welcoming, but there, right in that song, you actually reinforce the fact that, the belief rather, I should say, that there are only two genders. You reinforce that you are either male or female. And this person said, and I count myself as neither, and so clearly I'm not included in this prayer. So I said, wait, because this is a merism, this is a spectrum. A merism is from the highest to the lowest, or from the east to the west. And everything in between. And so I said, the way I've always read this is a merism, from men to women and those in between. But this person was very clear to me that actually, even though I might have been describing it that way and believing it that way, what it actually did, the words that were coming out of my mouth, reinforced this binary gender paradigm. And throughout all of this, even though we added women into the liturgy, and even though we added women into the service and brought people together, we still very much kept the maleness of God. And that, it turns out, is a very big challenge for more and more people, especially the youngest generation, who really struggle with the maleness of God, particularly as they explore gender fluidity in a way that is so profoundly different to how we may have understood gender when we were younger. And so God still feels very male, even though we include liturgy, even though we translate certain terms away. When we say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam, that really is, blessed are you, masculine singular, Adonai, our Lord God, rule our God, King of the universe, King of this world. And we can translate that away. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe. But we are still actually using male terms. And that becomes a real challenge. Judith Plaskow, the author, says the hand that takes us out of Egypt is a male hand, both in the Bible and in our contemporary imaginations. And what's the issue with that? Well, we turn to Mary Daly for that, who says if God is male, then the male is God. And ultimately, theology informs practice as much as practice reinforces theology. And so if our practice is to reinforce maleness, or a binary gender paradigm of only male and female, then that's going to be expressed in who is welcome in our community and who is not essentially seen. So Reform Judaism led the way for inclusivity in terms of gender in the past. Now we know that without question that gender is a social construct and not a biological reality. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves, and it's a really challenging, searching question, is why are we continuing to be bound by a social construct that fails to see the full diversity of God's creation? Why are we not, as Reformed Jews, celebrating those Jews who reveal to us more of the wonders of humanity, more of the complexity? Why is it that we're still bound to liturgy that essentially pretends that those people don't exist? And what does gender fluidity mean? For many people, this is quite scary, and I understand that. It's quite challenging. But think back 30, 40, 50 years, the idea of women's rights was quite scary. The idea of women being included in the liturgy was quite scary. We have to be able to get past that fear and ask ourselves, what do we do with Judaism and gender in particular? Because we took steps in the past, what are the steps that we need to take now? And that's a long, complicated, important conversation. And part of that conversation is in this Sunday's Introduction to Reform Judaism course. I really encourage you to join us. The topic is moving beyond bounded existence and control. I profoundly believe that you cannot be an authentic Reform Jew without honestly appraising gender. And that's a big statement. I think you can't be an authentic Reform Jew without honestly appraising gender. That doesn't mean that we all agree on gender, but it means that we need to be able to discuss it as a social construct, how that social construct may have held us back in the past, and what do we do about it today. There is no one right answer to what do we do about it today. The only way we can answer it is together as a community. So I encourage you to join us for our Kabbalat Shabbat service, for our Torah study, for our Shacharit service tomorrow. And also, please come and join on Sunday. Come and join either on Zoom or in person to discuss moving beyond bounded existence and control. Because Judaism, even Talmudic Judaism, it turns out, is much more gender fluid than most people realize. I wrote an entire thesis on it, and it's fascinating. So please come and join us. Help us to move the community to start discussing next steps. What's appropriate? How do we ultimately hold tradition and modernity together? When tradition speaks in a very simplistic gender voice and modernity speaks in a much more complex, nuanced and exciting voice. And then when we look back at our tradition and discover it wasn't always so simple and gendered and bounded and so on. There were, in fact, many expressions of gender fluidity. What do we do with them? Come and join us for the conversation. I think it's going to be fascinating. I hope to see you this weekend. I wish you Shabbat Shalom.